In early 1815, Europe believed the problem had been solved. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had reshaped the continent through nearly 2 decades of war, had been defeated, forced to abdicate, and exiled to the island of Elba. The major European powers met in Vienna to restore balance. Monarchies were re-established, borders were redrawn. Stability, at least on paper, had returned, but Napoleon was not finished. In March 1815, he escaped Elba and landed in southern France with a small group of loyal followers. The move was bold, almost reckless. He did not arrive with a massive army. He arrived with reputation. As he marched north toward Paris, French troops sent to arrest him instead joined him. Officers who once opposed him switched allegiance. Within weeks, he reclaimed control of France without firing a single shot in his own country. Europe reacted quickly. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed a new coalition. Their objective was simple: defeat Napoleon permanently. This time there would be no negotiated exile that allowed him to return. Napoleon understood the urgency. He knew the coalition forces would mobilize from multiple directions. If they united before he acted, France would face overwhelming numbers. His only viable strategy was speed. Strike one army before it could combine with another. The coalition forces were positioned in Belgium, a British-led army under the Duke of Wellington, and a Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. Napoleon's plan was to move between them, defeat each separately, and regain momentum before the full weight of Europe could close in. In mid-June 1815, Napoleon moved north with precision. Initial clashes favored the French. At Ligny, Napoleon defeated the Prussians, forcing them to retreat. Simultaneously, French forces engaged Wellington's army at Quatre-Bras, preventing full coordination between the Allies. The plan was unfolding as intended, but warfare rarely follows intention perfectly. Though defeated at Ligny, the Prussians were not destroyed. Instead of retreating east as Napoleon expected, Blücher redirected his army northward, maintaining the possibility of rejoining Wellington. Wellington, meanwhile, withdrew to a defensive position near the village of Waterloo. The location was carefully chosen. A ridge offered natural elevation. Farms and buildings along the field could serve as defensive strongpoints. Rain fell heavily the night before battle. The ground became thick and muddy. Artillery movement slowed. Cavalry charges would lose momentum. Both armies understood the conditions, but neither could avoid them. On the morning of June 18, 1815, the two forces faced each other. Napoleon commanded roughly 70,000 men. His army included experienced veterans and newly recruited soldiers. Many still believed in his leadership, though the campaign was unfolding quickly. Wellington's force was similarly sized but diverse. It included British troops, Dutch units, Belgian soldiers, and German contingents. Discipline varied, but Wellington was known for defensive skill. He preferred to let the enemy attack first. The battlefield stretched between two ridges, with open farmland in between. Key positions dotted the landscape: the farmhouse of Hougoumont on the Allied right, La Haye-Saint near the centre, and smaller farms anchoring the flanks. Wellington deployed most of his troops behind the ridge, limiting their exposure to French artillery. From Napoleon's perspective, much of the Allied army was hidden from direct view. Timing mattered. Napoleon delayed his initial assault, waiting for the ground to dry enough to support effective artillery fire. Each hour that passed, however, increased the chance that Prussian forces could reappear on the battlefield. This was the tension. Beneath every decision, Napoleon needed decisive victory before reinforcements arrived. Wellington needed only to hold the difference between attack and defense shaped the entire day. As morning stretched toward midday, orders moved through ranks. Cannon were positioned. Infantry prepared to advance. Cavalry adjusted formations. Europe watched from a distance. If Napoleon won, he could stabilize his rule and negotiate from strength. If he lost, the empire he built would collapse completely. The rain had stopped. The field was ready. And by nightfall, the question of whether Napoleon's return would succeed or fail would no longer be theoretical. It would be decided on that muddy ground near Waterloo. Shortly before midday on June 18, 1815, the first French guns opened fire. Napoleon had waited for the ground to firm slightly after the night's rain. Artillery was central to his strategy. Soft mud reduced the effectiveness of cannonballs, which normally bounced and tore through ranks. Every delay had risk, but attacking too early would weaken impact. The bombardment began steadily. Smoke drifted across the field. Wellington's troops, positioned behind the ridge, remained largely protected from direct fire. The terrain concealed much of his army from Napoleon's view. The first major French assault targeted Hougoumont, a fortified farmhouse on the Allied right. What was intended as a diversion quickly became a sustained struggle. French infantry pressed repeatedly against the walls and gates. British and Allied defenders held firm. Hougoumont consumed men and time. Instead of drawing Wellington's attention away from the center, it absorbed increasing numbers of French troops. The fight there became relentless, with close-quarter combat inside courtyards and along hedges. The position never fell. While Hougoumont burned and smoldered, Napoleon prepared a larger attack against Wellington's center. French infantry advanced uphill toward the ridge. Columns moved forward under fire. As they approached, Wellington's troops rose from behind the crest and delivered controlled volleys at close range. The slope disrupted French cohesion. Units struggled to deploy effectively from column into line under pressure. The assault faltered. French soldiers withdrew, reorganized, and tried again. The pattern repeated: advance, contact, recoil. Napoleon adjusted. He committed heavy cavalry to exploit what he believed were signs of weakness in the Allied line. Squadrons of cuirassiers, armored horsemen, surged forward in dramatic charges. The ground betrayed them. Mud reduced speed. Artillery positions were overrun temporarily, but Allied infantry formed defensive squares, tight formations bristling with bayonets. Cavalry could not penetrate these without support. Lacking infantry coordination, the charges lost momentum. Wave after wave of cavalry rode uphill, only to circle and withdraw. The spectacle was striking, but the results were limited. Meanwhile, distant movement appeared on the eastern horizon. Prussian forces were approaching. Earlier in the day, Napoleon had detached a portion of his army to intercept them, believing he could delay their arrival. But the Prussians pressed forward despite earlier defeat at Ligny. Their presence added urgency to every French decision. As afternoon progressed, pressure mounted. Napoleon intensified attacks against La Haye-Sainte, a key farmhouse near the center of Wellington's line. After prolonged fighting, French forces captured the position. This opened space for artillery to move closer and fire directly into the Allied center. For a moment, the situation appeared unstable for Wellington. His forces had endured hours of bombardment and repeated assaults. Casualties mounted. Sections of the line bent under strain. Yet Wellington remained committed to holding position. He knew that every hour gained increased the likelihood of Prussian reinforcement. His strategy was not dramatic breakthrough. It was endurance. Prussian troops began engaging French forces on the right flank. What had started as distant concern now became active confrontation. Napoleon was forced to divert resources to contain this new threat. The battlefield widened. French units that might have reinforced the center were redirected eastward. Coordination became increasingly complex. Napoleon's advantage lay in speed and concentration of force. Now his army was stretched. Evening approached. Napoleon made a final decision. He committed his Imperial Guard, veteran troops regarded as the most disciplined and reliable in his army. Historically, the Guard was used sparingly. Their deployment signaled seriousness. They advanced toward the Allied center in measured formation. Wellington observed carefully. His line had held all day. If it broke now, the entire position would collapse before full Prussian support could stabilize the field. The Guard climbed the slope, under fire. Smoke obscured visibility. Musket volleys exchanged at close range. Accounts differ on precise sequences, but what followed was decisive. The Guard did not break through. Some units were repelled by concentrated fire. Others withdrew under pressure. For the first time that day, elements of Napoleon's most trusted troops were seen retreating. The psychological impact was immediate. If the Guard could not secure victory, what could? Wellington recognized the moment. He ordered a general advance. Allied forces moved forward across the ridge. Prussian units pressed harder on the French flank. French formations, already strained by hours of combat and divided attention, began to yield. The retreat spread gradually, then rapidly. Waterloo had not been decided by a single charge or a single error. It had been decided by accumulation, time, terrain, coordination, and the arrival of reinforcements. As daylight faded, Napoleon's army withdrew from the field. The gamble had failed. As darkness settled over the field near Waterloo, the outcome was no longer uncertain. The French army was in retreat. Units withdrew in disorder, attempting to regroup along the road south. What had begun as a calculated campaign to divide and defeat coalition forces had ended in collapse. Napoleon had lost, but the significance of Waterloo extended far beyond the battlefield. For Napoleon personally, the defeat closed the final chapter of his political career. After the loss, he returned briefly to Paris, but there was little room for negotiation. Confidence in his leadership had eroded. The French government recognized that continued resistance would invite invasion and further destruction. Within weeks, Napoleon abdicated for a second time. This time, exile would be different. Instead of Elba, close enough to Europe to attempt return, he was sent to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. There would be no second escape. The era of Napoleonic rule was over. For France, Waterloo marked the end of expansionist ambition that had defined the previous decade and a half. The country would remain influential, but no longer dominant through conquest. For Britain, the victory confirmed its rising global position. Wellington emerged as a national figure of lasting prominence. British naval and military power had already shaped the broader war against Napoleon. Waterloo reinforced that influence. For Prussia, participation in the victory strengthened its political standing within Europe. The coordination between Wellington and Blücher demonstrated that coalition warfare, once fragmented and unreliable, could succeed when managed effectively. But perhaps the most important consequence was strategic. The Congress of Vienna, interrupted by Napoleon's return, resumed with renewed determination. European powers sought not only to punish France, but to create a balanced system, designed to prevent a single state from dominating the continent again. The Concert of Europe emerged from this effort, an informal framework through which major powers cooperated to manage disputes. While not flawless, it contributed to relative stability among great powers for decades. Waterloo did not end all wars in Europe. It did, however, end a cycle of near-constant continental upheaval driven by one leader's ambition. The battle also carried lessons in leadership and timing. Napoleon had built his reputation on speed, concentration of force, and decisive engagement. At Waterloo, those strengths were constrained by circumstance. Whether delayed artillery effectiveness, Prussian resilience complicated the plan. Coordination under pressure proved more difficult than anticipated. Wellington, by contrast, relied on defense, patience, and terrain. He positioned troops behind the ridge, absorbing pressure rather than meeting it head-on. His objective was not dramatic victory, but sustained resistance until reinforcement arrived. Blücher's persistence ensured that earlier defeat at Ligny did not remove Prussia from the campaign. That decision, to regroup and return rather than retreat entirely, shaped the day's final outcome. Waterloo demonstrates that battles are rarely decided by a single moment alone. They are shaped by preparation, by response to uncertainty, and by the ability to adapt when plans meet resistance. Napoleon's final gamble rested on defeating enemies separately before they could unite. At Waterloo, unity prevailed. In the years that followed, Napoleon's legacy would remain complex. He had reformed administrative systems, reshaped legal codes, and altered European borders. Yet his ambition had also led to immense destruction. Waterloo became the defining punctuation mark of that era. It is remembered not only because an army retreated, but because a political order shifted. Monarchies regained stability. Power balances recalibrated. A continent exhausted by war moved cautiously toward a different structure. The field near Waterloo today is quiet. Farms stand where artillery once thundered. The ridge remains, gentle and unassuming dot, but on that June day in 1815, it became the place where ambition met coalition and lost. Waterloo was not simply a battle dot, it was a conclusion dot, it was war, before it became legend.